everyone, my name is Angell Shieh and I'm excited to be giving the workshop today, which I've titled Reason for Faith, Scientific Apologetics, the Compatibility of Science and Faith. So before we hop in, I just want to share a little bit about my background. So I went to undergraduate at MIT, and while there I studied biology. I became fascinated with how the different cells in the body worked. I started doing research and I did my undergraduate thesis with a professor named Robert Horvitz, who studied these little worms called C. elegans, and in 2002 he won the Nobel Prize for discovering programmed cell death, an essential process in cancer. And so then after I graduated, I went to UCSF to do an MD and a PhD, and there I studied signaling pathways of leukemia and whether we could discover new therapeutics by inhibiting those pathways. And this is the paper that got published out of that work. I then moved to San Diego to do my pediatric residency, and then I became a pediatrician for 4 years prior to moving now to Pittsburgh. And so just hearing my story, you can tell that I love science. It was something that I was always fascinated by, how things work, why things are the way they are, being able to have the knowledge to diagnose disease and then treat it. But at the same time, as I was getting more and more into academia, there was also a strong pressure to believe that science was all there was. That science was the answer to who we are, how we are created. And in fact, that anyone who believes in God is considered misguided and engaging in something mythical rather than real. And for me as a Christian, this was hard to reconcile. And yet when I tried to defend my point of view, I didn't know what to say. And so that launched me into an investigation into science and faith. Were they contradictory, or could they be complementary? What was the evidence that God existed, if he did at all? And it was through the investigation, which started in college, that I began to gain a greater understanding of the answers and a stronger confidence in God. And so I want to present some of what I learned. I wish I had hours to talk, but I'd put you all to sleep. And so it's going to be pretty condensed, more of a survey than an in-depth study of the topic. But hopefully it'll whet your appetite to study this more and continue to ask questions. My goal today is to show you that science and faith are not contradictory as many people claim, but rather they are compatible. And in fact, modern scientific discoveries actually seem to support the view that God exists more so than not. And so let's start with looking at where people think there's a conflict between science and faith. Science has made so much progress in the past 300 years, leaps and bounds above every other field. And so it makes it seem like science is where true knowledge is. People claim that scientific knowledge is more certain than other types of knowledge. And then when looking at the conclusions found in science, some people even go on to say that it gives us no reason for believing in God anymore. People in ancient cultures, they didn't understand the natural world. And so when they saw lightning, they assumed there must be Thor, the god of lightning. Or when they wanted their plants to grow, they prayed to Jupiter, the god of farming. They used to plug God in to plug the gaps in their understanding of the world. But science has now plugged in those gaps, and so they say we don't need God. Richard Dawkins, a famous atheist, put it this way: faith is a great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Faith is belief in spite of, even perhaps because of, the lack of evidence. And so when we think about science and faith, there is this perspective today that scientists are the intelligent and logical ones, while the religious are irrational and antiquated. But was this perception always the case? Well, actually, when we consider the historical origins of Western science, the answer is no. Historically, the whole process of scientific inquiry arose out of a Christian worldview because Christians believe that nature is a creation of God. God is a rational God, and therefore creation is rational and can be understood. One of the contributions of Christianity to modern thought was the desacralization of nature. That the sun isn't some capricious sun god that burns brighter when he gets mad, and lightning isn't what Zeus throws down when he gets angry. No, these are objects of God's creation that are subject to the laws of nature and can be studied in a rational, systemic manner because a rational God created them. And the fundamentals of science are rooted in a Christian worldview. And that's what Johannes Kepler, the discoverer of planetary motion, said when he said the chief aim of all investigations of the external world should be to discover the rational order and harmony which has been imposed on it by God. And so the first scientists were Christians who believed that they were discovering the rational order and harmony which has been imposed upon nature and our world by God. And these are people like René Descartes, creator of the Cartesian coordinate system used in geometry and algebra, Isaac Newton, one of the greatest scientists and mathematicians ever, anyone who's taken physics, those 3 laws of motion, universal gravitation, but also a theologian. Gregor Mendel, the father of modern genetics, who studied the inheritance of particular traits in pea plants, leading to the discovery of Mendelian genetics. He too was an Austrian monk, and many, many others. And it's not just people back in the day, even scientists today. One of them who is Francis Collins. He's a former director of the Human Genome Project, currently the director of the NIH. He's heading up the effort right now to get the corona vaccine produced. Hopefully he gets it. Well, he's a former atheist turned Christian who said, quote, "I find no conflict between being a rigorous scientist who will not accept your conclusion about nature until you show me the data, and being a person who believes in a personal God who is the author of all of creation and who is actually interested in human beings, including me, even now." It's worth pointing out that even today, surveys have shown that about 40% of scientists working at elite universities in America believe in the existence of a personal God. Not to put too much emphasis on this, just because people believe it doesn't mean it's right. But it just goes to show that there is no inherent logical contradiction between the scientific method and the claims of Christianity. And why is that? It's because science and faith are meant to explain two different things. And it goes back to the issue of how versus why. Take, for example, this tea kettle. The tea kettle is boiling. If I ask, why is it boiling? How would you answer that question? Well, this is how science answers it. Why is it boiling? Well, because gas is being burned that adds heat to the kettle, which based on its material properties transfers the heat to the water inside the kettle. Then because of the specific heat, the boiling temperature of the water, there's an increase of vapor pressure leading to transition from the liquid to the gas state. And that is why the water is boiling. And while it's all informative and true, 9 times out of 10, when people ask you, why is the water boiling? They're probably expecting an answer more like this. Well, it's because I want a cup of tea. I want to make ramen. And they want the answer for the reason or purpose for the event. And so we see that science provides answers, but not all the answers. It provides an answer to how something may work based on our observations, but not the purpose of why it is in such a state. Science is the explanation of natural phenomena through observation and experimentation. But by itself, it's only capable of giving us a partial view of the whole reality we live in. But we need both the how and the why together to provide a fuller picture of what's going on in the world we live in. And so, if there's no conflict between science and Christianity, where does the conflict rise? Where's the tension when it comes to science and Christianity? In what sense are the two conflicting? The conflict lies not between science and Christianity, but between a particular philosophy and Christianity. And that philosophy is called naturalism. So what's naturalism? Naturalism is defined as the idea or belief that only natural laws and forces operate in the world. Only natural laws and forces, not supernatural laws, not spiritual, they aren't real, because the physical world is all there is. That's the only reality. And because science is dedicated to exploring the natural world, scientific truth is the only relevant truth, superior to all other kinds of knowledge, and that's the belief. Now, if you think about it, naturalism is not science. It's actually a worldview. It's a certain view of the world. It's a belief that the physical world is all there is. It's not something proven scientifically. It's an assumption made about reality that actually requires faith. And when you think about it, both Christians and atheists actually believe that the natural world is there. It's real. Science is an effective way to figure out how the natural world works. But atheists believe that that's all there is, matter. Whereas Christians believe that there are non-physical aspects of our existence that are not explainable through the natural world and through the lens of science. That we have immaterial souls with genuine free will. That there's an immaterial supernatural God that caused the universe to come into existence. And that is where the conflict lies. Because obviously both worldviews can't be true. So which has more evidence and reason going for it? And I want to suggest that this is where science complements the claims of Christianity. Because modern scientific discoveries have actually pointed more and more to the existence of some supernatural, intelligent creator that created our universe and designed life on this planet. And so what might those discoveries be? To start off, I want to talk about something called the Cosmological Argument. This argument states simply that, number one, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Number two, the universe began to exist, and therefore the universe has a cause. It's pretty logical. If the first two premises are true, then it must follow that the universe has some sort of cause or creator. And so let's start with premise one. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. I think this is pretty intuitive. Say this stuffed animal landed in front of you. What do? Say, that's cool? No, you immediately turn to see who put it there. You don't say that it just appeared out of thin air, because things don't just do that. You don't see things just popping up. Everything that begins to exist has some sort of cause. And so if that's true, then what about premise two? Premise two says the universe began to exist. And here's where the discovery of the Big Bang really changed things. For a long time, scientists believed that the universe always existed infinitely into the past. If the universe was all there ever was, all there ever will be, then there's no need for some sort of cause. It just was, never actually began to exist. But in the 1900s, new evidence started to turn the tide. First of all, the discovery of something called the red shift. When looking at the different galaxies, Hubble noticed that all the wavelengths were shifted into the red spectrum, meaning that they were accelerating away from us, just like the wavelength of sound elongates as a police car speeds by you. And if they're accelerating away, there must have been a starting point from which all of that began, some sort of Big Bang. Now, if this were true, scientists predicted that there should be a remnant level of heat or radiation, a sort of afterglow from that huge explosion. And sure enough, a few decades later, they found something called the cosmic background radiation, a background heat signature which matched the exact value that would be predicted if the universe started as a Big Bang, proving that theory to be correct. And so it showed that there was indeed a point in the finite time when the universe began to exist. Scientists have tried to get around this by proposing other theories like the steady state model or oscillating universe, but none of these have held weight against the evidence. And so, if whatever begins to exist has a cause, and the universe began to exist, then the universe has to have had a cause. And the cause of the universe can't be part of the universe, or else it wouldn't have been able to create it. It must have been outside of it, outside of matter, time, and space, there from the very beginning, an uncaused cause, which by definition is God. And that's one piece of evidence that points us to something more than this physical world that we see. And so now I want to move on to another set of scientific discoveries that also point to the existence of an intelligent creator. It's something that we call the fine-tuning of the universe. And so, who knows what this is? It's the gravitational constant. Scientists have found that this physical constant and many others, like Planck's constant, the mass of an electron, the strong and weak force, are so finely tuned to allow life to exist in our universe today. If just a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller, the universe would be inhospitable for life. And that's so fine-tuned that there must be something or someone that put these into place. And so here's a video that explains this. Let's watch that. So this is a line of argument for fine-tuning. The observation that our physical world has many constants that must be finely tuned in order to permit and be compatible with life observed in it seemed to point to the fact that rather than chance and necessity being the causes, that there is some sort of designer. And so it seems that the more we know and learn about the universe, its origins, its qualities, the more it looks like our universe and world were designed. Stephen Hawking said, "The odds against a universe like ours, emerging out of something like the Big Bang, are enormous. I think clearly there are religious implications when you start to discuss the origins of the universe." And so it's interesting, from the time of the Enlightenment up until the middle of the 20th century, when the popular consensus was that the universe had always existed for eternity, the naturalistic worldview and atheism actually seemed plausible. There's no need for God to create any universe or to design any universe because the universe appeared simple and eternal. And Christians seemed backwards and unscientific for claiming that there was a beginning to the universe or for attributing the design of the universe to God. But the discovery of these last 50, 60 years or so has shown us the enormous complexity of the universe we live in, challenging the assumption that this could arise by chance. And they've shown us that the universe had a beginning, which strongly implies the existence of God who caused that beginning, all of which is consistent with the Christian worldview. Robert Jastrow, an agnostic, non-Christian NASA scientist, he remarked, "For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance, he's about to conquer the highest peak, and as he pulls himself over the final rock, he's greeted by a band of theologians who've been sitting there for centuries." And so what we found is that science seems to point us to conclude that there is some supernatural creator or God. Now, some of you probably wondering, that might be in the world of astronomy, but what about evolution? For many people, this is perceived as the major area of conflict between science and faith. Richard Dawkins claims that Darwin has completely destroyed this argument from design, the fine-tuning of the universe, that Darwinism has made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. And so let's talk about that. Today I'm going to talk about the NeoDarwinian theory of evolution, which is basically the modern version of evolution that have been derived from Darwin's theories. And so briefly, the NeoDarwinian theory of evolution has two main parts. The first is natural selection, which is the idea of the survival of the fittest. Animals that don't do as well die off. So after many years, traits that help you survive get passed on down the generations. For example, with these birds, if you have webbing on your feet helps you get food more easily, then maybe those birds will get all the food, and then the other birds will die off. And web feet will get passed to later generations since those are the ones that actually reproduce. And so where do these different traits actually come from? Well, variations come from random mutations and genetic drift. The mutations we're talking about here are mutations that change an animal's DNA sequence, resulting in physical changes like webbed feet. Genetic drift is changes in traits of an entire population because of random sampling. It's another way that different traits can emerge. And so that's the first part. The second part of Neo-Darwinian evolution is the idea of common ancestry, that all the complexity of life that we see today originated from a common ancestor long in the past. And here's where it's useful to distinguish between micro and macro evolution. Microevolution is the observable action of natural selection on the traits of a species. For example, birds with webbed versus non-webbed feet. Another common example is antibiotic resistance in bacteria. It's uncontroversial, it's observable, reproducible, and the mechanism is undeniable. Macroevolution is what's shown here on the right. Here the idea is that natural selection operating over huge timescales produced all the different kinds of species that have ever existed from a common, very simple ancestral life form. This theory that everything all came from the same ancestor is actually pretty hard to prove because you can't go back in time. What scientists can do is to use evidence from microevolution at 3.8 billion years and put together a plausible argument for macroevolution. This part of the theory actually has its own problems, but before we get to that, let's talk about the conflict. Is there actually a logical conflict between the theory of evolution and the claims of Christianity? Because the argument usually goes something like this. Evolution has shown us that life appeared through many generations of gradual change. And because we have a naturalistic explanation of how things came about, there can be no supernatural being who made this happen. But is this really a conflict? The argument depends on a certain assumption. And what is that assumption? The assumption is that if there are naturalistic or scientific explanations for how something happened, it means that no one could have purposely made it happen. In other words, if we can explain through science how things came about, then that must mean there is no other explanation needed. Now, is that assumption true? I want to suggest that it's not. And as an example, I turn to apples. Who's tasted Fuji apples before? I love Fuji apples, and I heard that 80% of apples grown in China are actually Fuji. Well, there's a completely naturalistic and scientific explanation for how they came to exist. It's a crossbreed between two kinds of apples. Pollen from one plant lands on the blossom of another plant, and then you get a crossbreed. And so you just need these two types of trees to be close enough to a beehive. But the truth is that Fuji apples were developed in the 1930s by growers in Fujisaki, Japan. They crossbred these two kinds of apples, and that's how we have the Fuji apple. And so they were purposely engineered. But you also have a scientific explanation. Likewise, it's perfectly possible that God created all the different kinds of life, and that there are naturalistic or scientific explanations for how that happened. It's possible to believe in evolution and believe in God, and Darwin himself agreed. Darwin himself cautioned people not to take his theory too far, and he wrote this in a letter to a friend. My theories are not at all necessarily atheistical. It seems to me absurd to doubt that man may be an ardent theist and an evolutionist. Just because there's a naturalistic explanation for something that happens, it doesn't rule out the possibility that God caused it to happen or utilized evolution to create the diversity of life that we see today. It's clear that Darwin deeply appreciated that the theory of evolution did not necessarily lead a person to atheistic conclusions. And he agreed that one could have both strong belief in God and also a strong belief in evolution. All that being said, however, there are weaknesses of macroevolutionary theory that we should consider. And those weaknesses have to do with the fossil record and the origin of life. So starting with the fossil record, Darwin's theory of gradual change through random mutations over time suggests that when you look at the fossil record, we should see something like this tree of life, where one species turns to another species through slow, smooth, gradual processes over a long period of time. However, if you look at that fossil record, what you see is not these nice smooth branches indicating gradual changes from one species to another. Instead, we have something like this. This chart depicts what's called the Cambrian explosion, a relatively short time in evolutionary history where many of the different animal phyla appear suddenly, without transition in the fossil record. If you think about it, this is a serious problem for Darwin's theory of natural selection and gradual change over time, because we don't see the gradual change at all in this fossil record. And Darwin understood this. He understood that if his theory is correct, then the fossil record should be full of intermediate links between species. He said, why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, And this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory. The explanation lies, as I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geological record. Not only does Darwin know that his theory predicts a fossil record full of intermediate species, he also knows that the fossil record at that time didn't support his theory. And so what's his response? Well, it's because the record is imperfect. In other words, we haven't found everything yet. There must be more. Give it more time, and they'll turn up. But the reality is that even now, 150 years later, hundreds and thousands of fossils later, the shape of the fossil record is pretty much the same. In fact, Stephen Jay Gould, an atheist and evolutionist writing in the late 20th century, said this: "The absence of fossil evidence for intermediary stages between major transitions in organic design, indeed our inability, even in our imagination, to construct functional intermediates in many cases has been a persistent and nagging problem for gradualistic accounts of evolution." A persistent and nagging problem. 150 years later, still very little evidence in the fossils for Darwin's theory of gradual change over time. And that poses a problem for evolution. And then there's this. Evolutionary theory claims to explain how life evolved from the first organism into another, into the variety of life that we see today. But natural selection can only operate on an organism. You first need an organism. And I think the bigger question, and perhaps the more difficult question, is the origin of life. How did life arise on our planet? How did the first cells arise? Can it be explained through purely natural processes by chance? The more we learn about the living cell, we see how complex life really is. There are amino acids that form proteins. There are nucleic acids that form DNA and RNA. And you need all of them together to make a cell. And that leads us to some issues. First of all, where did the first amino acids come from? And secondly, how did the first amino acids and nucleotides assemble themselves to form functional proteins and DNA? You know, there's not much time to go into this right now, but origin of life scientists have been trying to answer these questions for years, and different theories have come and gone. One of the biggest experiments is the Miller-Urey experiment. They're trying to answer the question of where the first amino acids came from. And the experiment was done in the 1950s at University of Chicago, and they attempted to explain how we got life from no life. They put in the gases that were supposed to be in the early Earth's atmosphere, methane, hydrogen, ammonia, and water, heated it, and then sent electrical bolts through it to simulate the early Earth. And they let it run for a week and see, what did you get? And what they found is they found amino acids. And what are amino acids? Those are things, buff guys take before going to the gym, but they're the building blocks for life. 20 different kinds, and they produce some of them. And that was heralded as the answer. That's how life started, from non-life to life. But it turns out there are actually some problems. First of all, the experiment claims that you put hydrogen, methane, ammonia in with water. Let them react in close proximity with one another, and then you get these amino acids out. But in reality, any hydrogen in the early atmosphere, it would just floated away. And if there was a primordial soup, instead of the elements coming together, the natural processes of dilution would have actually prevented the proper concentrations that were necessary to form amino acids in the test tube environment. On top of that, since the 1960s, we've shown that the early atmosphere is more likely to contain carbon dioxide and nitrogen. And when you rerun the experiment with these guys, what do you make? Cyanide, formaldehyde, poison. And so the experiment leads us far away from the origin of life. In fact, Miller himself said, "The problem of the origin of life has turned out to be much more difficult than I and most other people envisioned." Secondly, even the simplest cell is very complex. The simplest cell has 182 genes consisting of 30,000 amino acids arranged in just the right way to give it its function. And the odds of amino acids lining up in the exact order by chance, 30,000 times, that's dismally low. It's 1 out of 20, which is the number of amino acids to the 30,000th power. Impossible. In fact, to even get one functional protein molecule by chance is hard enough. If you do all the calculations, taking into account peptide bond formations, selection of the right isomers, and functionality of the protein, the probability of getting one functional 150 amino acid protein by chance is 10 to the 164th power. Smart people have calculated that the odds of finding one tiny particular particle in the entire universe is 10 to the 80th power. So to make a functional protein by chance is orders of magnitude harder. No wonder in experiments to form a functional protein from chance, they've been impossible without some sort of experimental manipulation. But you think still, with billions and billions of years, you can get that, right? But actually there weren't billions of years for life to form. Scientists have found now that the age of the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. The first sign of life appeared about 4 billion years ago. That leaves only a short time frame of 500 million years in which life could develop from simple elements. And with the time it took for the Earth to cool, for the seas to form, and then life to appear, that's far too short a time for just chance alone. You need some other explanation. Thirdly, say somehow you do get amino acids that produce proteins. They're only a part of life that is required. The experiment did not and could not make DNA and RNA, nor subsequent experiments. And yet these are the blueprints that you need to replicate and reproduce. With only proteins after generation, that's it. You need DNA for cells to replicate, and you need replication to even start to undergo natural selection. Some speculate that perhaps there's a self-replicating RNA or some machinery that's able to start it all, but we haven't found it yet. And on top of that, DNA also contains instructions for how to form proteins and much of life itself. How did all that information get there in the first place? Chance alone can't explain that. And so looking at the issue of the origin of life, given the complexity of just forming the building blocks and to be able to put them together in a way to actually give life within a small time frame of only a few hundred million years, that's impossible without some sort of external influence helping it along. No wonder Fred Hoyle, a British atheist astronomer, once analogized the origin of life to a tornado sweeping through a junkyard, assembling a Boeing 747 from the materials therein. It's that hard. And so while evolution offers an explanation for how organisms can change over time, evolution has no proven explanation for how diversity of life arose in the first place. It offers no good explanation for where we get the starting materials to even begin with, apart from some sort of external force that could help it along. And again, scientific discoveries seem to only make it more and more improbable that life arose through random processes. Francis Crick, the discovery of DNA structure, he said, "An honest man, armed with all the knowledge available to us now, could only state that in some sense the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many other conditions which would have had to have been satisfied to get it going." So to sum up, the fossil record, the origin of life, they remain difficult questions for the theory of evolution. And it's claimed that all the complexity of life that we see in this world is explainable through natural, unguided processes. And then zooming out, if we were able to ignore these difficulties, at the end of the day, belief in the theory of evolution would not be necessarily incompatible with belief in God or Christianity, as we discussed before. And so to wrap it up, returning to our original question, science and faith, are they compatible? We've seen that the scientific method is not in conflict with the claims of Christianity. In fact, they're complementary to form a fuller picture of reality. Rather, it's a naturalistic worldview that is at odds with Christianity. And the contrary to what many popular atheists say today about science disproving Christianity, many recent scientific discoveries have actually shown how difficult it is for purely naturalistic processes to explain the origin of life and the universe. And in fact, much of the evidence is compatible with the existence of a supernatural creator and designer. It tells us that faith in God beyond our universe is reasonable, and this faith can be supplemented by and complementary with the evidence of science. You don't have to check your head at the door when you think about religion or walk into church. And for all the merits of science, the awesome things that we can do with science, there's a limitation to science. Sir Peter Medawar, a Nobel laureate in medicine, he said, "The existence of a limit to science is, however, made clear by its inabilities to answer childlike elementary questions. Questions such as, how did everything begin? What are we all here for? What's the point of living?" It turns out that as incredible of a tool as science is, it's actually ill-equipped to answer many of our bigger questions in life. Why are we here? What's the point of living? What's my purpose? What is a good life? But these are the questions that are so crucial to our existence, to how we are going to live in this life, that they need to be considered and thought through. And these are the things that we as Christians have the answer to through our faith and belief in God. Thank you.